I had a conversation with Robert Wright, who is the editor-in-chief of Blogging Heads TV, the host of the Wright Show podcast, and the publisher of the Nonzero newsletter, and he also was my boss when I used to work at Blogging Heads. We talked a bit about cognitive empathy and how it relates to the war in Ukraine. I also aired a few of my grievances about my online quasi-nemesis Mickey Kaus, and we discussed the future of Blogging Heads, perhaps even breaking some news about that. So, as always, remember to rate, review, share, tell your friends. You know the drill. Okay, enjoy the episode. I mean, one of the things I wanted to talk about was cognitive empathy, which is a
hobby horse of Bob's.
What would you call it, a hobby horse? I was thinking just a term you're hoping to popularize and an idea you're hoping to.
Well, no, it is a hobby horse. I mean, I should say I also publish the Nonzero newsletter, and I talk about it a lot there. It's not my term. I mean, empathy is just cognitive distinguishes this kind of empathy from the more familiar kind of feeling their pain empathy or emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is identifying with the feelings of people, and cognitive empathy is just kind of understanding how they view the world. I mean, understanding what feelings they're having, but not necessarily sympathizing with them. It's just, trying to understand how the world looks from their point of view. So, classic example these days would be Vladimir Putin. You don't have to like him. You don't have to sympathize with him, but I do maintain that it's in your interest to try to understand how he views the world.
Right. So one sort of meta question about this topic is cognitive empathy the best term to describe what you're talking about? Or if you want to spread this idea, is there a different term or something? Because often when I've heard you talk about cognitive empathy on your show, you have to say, well, I'm not talking about regular empathy. And that is a potential hurdle to spreading a idea that will take the world by fire if immediately people are a little unsure what it means. So I was wondering, we over the years, we've talked about this behind the scenes back when I used to work for you at Blogging Heads, trying to come up with different terms to embody ideas that you wanted to get it out into the world. And why do you stuck with cognitive empathy? I mean, there's possible other ones like, someone taking someone else's view, or perspective taking, or walk a mile in their shoes, or something like that could be a possible term instead.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think I may write a book that's in one sense or another about this, because I do claim that it's the miracle cure, that if everyone were better at understanding other people's points of views, whether they're in a, fundamentally zero-sum competitive relationship with them, or in a more cooperative relationship, or, as is usually the case, some combination of the two. Most people in the world are your frenemies, basically. That the world would just be way, way better off. Fewer wars, more win-win outcomes, and so on. So given that it is my hobby horse, and I may write a book about it, it'd be nice to have a term that doesn't put people off. And you're right that the word empathy tends to steer people in the direction of the kind of feel your pain kind of empathy. That's certainly true. And they're like, oh, so we need to understand poor Vladimir Putin. Is that what you're saying? And that's kind of a problem. On the other hand, I mean, I don't know what the answer is. As you know, one of my frenemies is Mickey Kaus, and apparently he's on your agenda. We're going to talk about him later, and I gather not in entirely flattering terms, judging.
Well, he said a couple things on the show about me that were not entirely flattering either. So.
Totally. Let's have a little dogfight here. Anyway, he and I have talked about this in the Parrot Room, which is our paywall version of our Friday podcast, and some interesting candidates have come up. I mean, one was cold empathy. One of our commenters came up with cold empathy. And that's in a way, see, I would have thought that cognitive kind of steers people in the right direction, and at least conveys that you don't mean regular empathy. It should at least signal like, oh, I need to hear more about what you mean, because you probably don't just mean regular empathy, or you wouldn't need the modifier, right? I would have thought that. But I have trouble. I mean, with people, I have trouble. Of course, See,
Yeah,
part of the
because
problem. Yeah,
when
go
you
ahead.
start talking about empathy and then your first example is Vladimir Putin, I think someone who's maybe half paying attention is gonna be like, "Oh, you feel bad for Vladimir Putin?" Like that's sort of the, you know.
Right.
So
Well,
I do think, yeah, some, I don't know, perspective taking is a term you've used also. And
that's a common term for it.
yeah.
It's not the sexiest term in the world. In a way, neither is cognitive empathy. I always thought there was an interesting contrast between cognitive and empathy that would might get people's attention. Strategic empathy is another term. McMaster used that term. I'm sure he would deploy it differently than I would. He would have a. Oh well, I don't know. Anyway, he has used that term. Katrina vanden Heuvel has used that term. And that maybe that's more intriguing. I don't know. But you tell me what is the which of those is the book you would most buy?
Well, I don't know what the best one is. I don't know. I think cognitive empathy does have these problems because empathy is the more common of those two words, and it has this touchy-feely
Right.
connotation to it, and can lead people to think you feel bad for someone or you pity them or something like that, even
Right.
though maybe that's not the dictionary definition of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think that might be, holding some people back. I mean, there's other, yeah, I mean, like I remember there was years ago, Black at Blogging Heads, we had some idea for something called Other Eyes, and
Right.
that's along the same sort of line or something. But I guess Other Eyes isn't doesn't really make any sense. But I don't know. Maybe if people,
Well, no, it does. I mean, looking through at the world through eyes other than your own.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, there's a lot of directions you could go, including, as you suggest, putting yourself in other people's shoes and so on. None of these seem to me to have bestseller written all over them. But that's just, some books, are not destined to be bestsellers, and that's life. I do think, but see, the problem isn't just nomenclature, and this is one of the things I would address in the book is that the actual cognitive mechanism of understanding someone's point of view is actually hard to divorce from becoming more sympathetic to them and more forgiving of them. That is a fact about the way the human mind works. I don't think it necessarily should work that way. I mean, I think I understand why it does work that way in terms of our evolutionary history, but I do think one should be able to separate the two, and that's a big kind of challenge, that you should be able to say, yes, I understand their point of view better now, and maybe even now I understand why it was almost inevitable that they would do what they did, and yet still say, if what they did was bad, they need to be punished. I feel kind of that way about Putin. I feel that the U.S. mismanaged the relationship, and what wound up happening not only was a fairly predictable outcome of U.S. policies, but was predicted going back years, even decades now. People said, if you start down this path of NATO expansion, here's where you're going to wind up. Then in 2008, they said, if you do what you're about to do, which is invite Ukraine to join, the guy who's now head of the CIA, Bill Burns, said in a memo to the Bush administration, Putin is going to start screwing around in eastern Ukraine if you do this, basically. And Bush did it anyway. So I on the one hand, I feel that it is in some sense you could use the word fault. On the other hand, he's the one who violated international law. We didn't. And so, and to me, that matters. And so he's the one who deserves punishment. And I think you should be able to hold all those thoughts in your mind at once. That a lot of leaders in his position would have done this. It was particularly predictable given what we know about his own psychology. But, sometimes you have to, I think, knowing, completely understanding why everyone did anything probably naturally inclines you toward forgiveness, but we do have to punish people as a practical matter sometimes. So
yeah, and there's some sort of deep, like, philosophical questions, like, underlying these things, like free will and,
yeah,
does the self exist or something? And maybe that's above my pay grade, but something, I mean, kind of a critique of what you've been saying, particularly about, understanding Putin's actions, um, I think would be like you're thinking, what would I do in his shoes? But then you're thinking, what would I do in his shoes? But he is different. I mean, he is a human, and he has some sort of natural concerns that anyone would have. But he also has his
Mhm.
own unique history and psychology, and things that we don't share. Just different people or people not in his cultural milieu. So one thing would be, you know, the sense of like the greatness of Russia and restoring some sort of like sense that there's a like Russian exceptionalism and stuff like this. This seems to be part of Putin's psychology that led to the invasion of Ukraine. But this is not, if I'm projecting myself
Yeah.
into Putin, I don't understand that. We Americans have our own
Right.
American exceptionalism type things, and it's hard for us to understand how other national, you know,
Right.
psychologies function. And so so your critique has been a lot about how like NATO, encroached further and further into the former Warsaw Pact countries and then into like former Soviet satellites and then right up to Russia's border. And
Well, former Soviet republics.
right, like the Baltic republics
Right.
and
And
then
Ukraine
Georgia, and which was
would be an example if that joined NATO. And Putin sees what we've been doing in Ukraine, sending in weapons for years and NATO trainers and so on, as being turning it into a de facto NATO outpost. Uh, that, but in answer to your question, I mean, you're right. You can start the exercise of cognitive empathy by saying, "Well, what would I do?" But you can then go further and say, like, well, okay, but what would kind of your average leader of a great power do, right? Leave aside particular Russian history and culture. You can say, well, what would an American president do if, like China, what it considered its big rival, did a security pact with Mexico, which meant that China could start putting troops and weapons in Mexico, and was already sending weapons in, and so on. And that's part of cognitive empathy. Is not the question of what would you expect Putin to do, but various more generic forms of the question. What would I do? What would the leader of a great power do? What would you expect the average leader of Russia do? Because we know, for example, that Boris Yeltsin, who was very different from Putin, was really steamed about this NATO thing too. And he was really steamed about our bombing Serbia over the Kosovo thing. And so and we also know that these views about Ukraine and NATO are widely shared among the national security elite in Russia. So some of these questions, for some versions of the question of what would you expect, what do things look like from that point of view, don't require you to understand Putin's psychology deeply or even necessarily Russian history real deeply. On the other hand, if you want to, I do think, you're pointing to a good point. There are different levels of the exercise, and you should keep going and say, okay, now what do we know about Vladimir Putin? Now, for me, this is a particularly easy exercise because I think I share some of his eccentricities. So, like, I think I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. He
you like to
does.
ride a horse shirtless through the
Oh,
rivers and
totally. And you would be shocked about some of the local ordinances here. I've actually gotten citations for riding my horse shirtless, and it's like it's in front of my own fucking house, okay? And like, cops are pulling up. Anyway, um, no, not that. The In that sense, we're very different. But sensitive to signs of disrespect. On the other hand, all these things are just parts of human nature, and parts of kind of declining power psychology. I mean, if you just said, well, we're talking about a declining power, okay? They used to be great. They're not as great. They've still got nuclear weapons, so you better be careful, but they know they're not as great. First thing you'd say is, well, don't shower them with disrespect and contempt. I mean, obviously, they're in a delicate psychological adjustment. It's like, right? It's like, show them some respect. We repeatedly have not done that. But anyway, that's an interesting point you're making about the gradations of the exercise, right? From
yeah,
generic,
and
what would I do, to what would you expect this person, Vladimir Putin, to do, given everything we know about Russia, Russian history, culture, his psychology, and so on?
right. And I mean, most people did not think he was actually going to invade Ukraine. And area experts were surprised, and people.
I wouldn't say that. I would say they were. I predicted he would invade if we did not
Or
meet
do a
some of his
total,
concessions, and a
seemingly
lot of area experts did. By the time he did it, they were surprised by the scale of the
yeah,
invasion.
a seemingly total invasion with this
Right.
idea that he was gonna like cleanse Ukraine of Nazi influence or something, or seemingly he wanted to topple the regime, or just the ambition
Right.
seemed to surprise people, and like the speeches he gave on the eve of the invasion seemed to surprise people. And yeah, just like he has particular historical concerns and understanding that are very alien to the average American. So one thing, I think this was John Gans in his newsletter, he wrote about this. Like there's some sort of possibly fringe understanding within Russia about like Lenin's role in the revolution, and whether like Lenin was in some respect like an agent of the West who was like
Hmm.
sent in to after the toppling of the czar to like mold the the revolution in a certain way. And so that, I mean, that's just like he has his own like understanding and mythology of history that like maybe you could find this somewhere in English analyses of Russian history, but like this is pretty unusual stuff. And it's but maybe who knows if what he actually believes what he says.
Yeah.
But he's saying weird stuff about like the Bolsheviks like screwed up in various ways. Just think that we, people in America, it's hard for us to understand. So he has his own weird beliefs, and of course the fact. I mean, another sort of, and this is not exactly a critique, but like you talk a lot about cognitive distortions, especially in relation to your work on Buddhism and psychology.
Cognitive biases. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, Putin is suffering from. It's hard to see your own cognitive biases and distortions. Maybe it's easier to see someone else's, but clearly he's like fallen prey to some, confirmation bias and other common things that enabled him to think
Yeah.
that, his military was much better prepared than it actually was, that the Ukrainian people were crying out for, liberation from this regime. It seems like he actually did believe this, so he sort of like got high in his own supply or believed his own bullshit or something. And so we don't only have to like project ourselves into someone else's shoes or eyes or something, but like what are the distortions that they're going to fall prey to like within that? It seems difficult and
Yeah.
hard to predict.
Although I mean, those things to have predicted the scale of the invasion, it would have helped to know those things. I think to know that it was a mistake, that various of our policies were playing with fire wouldn't have taken any of that knowledge. I mean, after all, in 2014, after we did something else I don't think we should have done, which is basically intervene in and become part of a non-democratic transition of power in Ukraine. And after that, for really predictably, I think almost, he seized Crimea and did this stuff in the Eastern Donbass. He wasn't suffering. He wasn't suffering from misinformation then, right? He pulled that off easily. Crimea
Right,
was a cakewalk, and so to predict that he would do things like invade, you didn't have to assume he'd be deeply misinformed. He invaded Crimea, he took it, and he wasn't misinformed.
Yeah, and also, I mean, this is sort of arguing against the kind of foreign policy that probably both of us would support. But like in retrospect, like should he have been punished by the international community more? Because he basically got Crimea. I guess there were some sanctions or something. It was barely a military conflict, and it wasn't like and Russia did not become an international pariah. Everyone was sort of like, well, this is messed up, but we'll sort of
Yeah.
like let you go. No one else recognized it, but he didn't. He was, if you look at things from his perspective, intervention in Georgia in 2008, intervention in Ukraine in 2014, he more or less gets away with these things without paying any sort of real price, and he's still in charge of the country.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, this would be like maybe the neocon point or something, is like, we didn't punish bad behavior, and it made him think, oh, the West, they'll fall over. They don't really care about
they
anything.
do say that. They do say that. I would say the Georgia thing, he didn't really start. I mean, the Georgian president, Saakashvili or whatever, thought he was going to get more Western support than he did. But I think he started the hostilities. There was a separatist part of Georgia that was already occupied by Russian troops as part of an EU peacekeeping deal. Okay.
Mhm.
And they did not, as I understand it, fire the first shot. That said, he then did take advantage of the opportunity to go into Georgia proper and so on.
Like he sort of made a series of like semi-risky geopolitical bets, and they didn't backfire on him,
Yeah,
over his until 6 weeks ago, seemingly.
right.
And so you get to see how someone who is both a authoritarian leader who's surrounded by a coterie of people who want to kiss his ass and tell him only good news, who also has like demonstrably pulled off various international exploits without suffering any strong consequences and
Yeah,
winning various territories and stuff. He was like, okay, this is just number three, and it'll be, yeah. So like, yeah, obviously some, he gambled. He was either much more of a gambler or much more poorly informed, or I don't know. Like, I mean, you wrote a piece like, is he crazy? Like, he doesn't seem. I don't think he's like seeing, visions or something. Or but clearly, like, he wasn't getting super accurate information
I
about the state of the world.
yeah, and I think he just developed a real bee in his bonnet about this because he felt consistently disrespected. And I know the feeling. Nobody likes to feel disrespected, and it's like, and I think that really was kind of simmering within him. And I don't think, he's crazy in the sense of hearing voices, but I think that may have contributed to some decision making that wasn't wise. I mean, I still think he could come out of this war okay politically in terms of domestic politics, but I
It's
think
hard. Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, okay, so there was clearly a failure of cognitive empathy on Putin's part. It seems like he really did believe that Ukrainians would greet the Russian invaders as liberators, and that this would be kind of a cakewalk.
seems that
Um,
way.
and leaders of great powers continually convince themselves that invading another country will be a good thing, and it seems to rarely work
Yeah,
out well.
we did that
Um,
with Iraq. Yeah,
yes, and like what was the last great power invasion of another country where the people were welcomed as liberators? Is there? I mean, can you think of one after 1945? And a lot of those countries were occupied by Nazi Germany. So, countries don't like being invaded, and rarely welcome
right.
welcome their invaders as friends. Like this, I don't know. It seems pretty
It
obvious,
is, of
but
course, Ukraine is nothing like the relationship of Iraq to America in the sense that everybody there speaks Russian, many as their native language, and many of them identified with Russia. Now, I think more of them identified with Russia, 10, 15 years ago than did now. And I don't think Putin totally got that things had changed. I mean, his conception of Ukraine goes way back. He took his honeymoon in Ukraine, okay? Ukraine, Crimea, and I don't think he has updated his conception of the changing sentiment much, especially the changing sentiment since 2014. That said, I suspect that we have an overly simple conception of where various allegiances in Ukraine lie, and that may now be coming to the fore. I mean, this thing is our conversation will post Tuesday. We may know more by then, but I think the war is moving to a part of Ukraine where more towns are going to feature at least some Russia sympathizers, possibly, especially since the ones who are leaving and heading west tend not to be the Russian sympathizers, probably disproportionately. So I think, but yeah, I take your point. I mean, uh, he didn't totally get the picture. There's no doubt about it. I am told that he doesn't use a smartphone and barely, if at all, even goes on the internet himself. And I think he relies on the old fashioned intelligence reports. And, that's obviously asking for trouble in the current environment.
right, and yeah, and just in terms of like the geopolitical chess kind of thing, I guess he thought that this would dissuade Ukraine from ever wanting to be in NATO, but now like Sweden and Finland want to like join NATO. So it seems like that was a huge strategic miscalculation just in terms of the pieces on the
Yeah.
board kind of thing. So yeah, this I mean I was I mean this is like the biggest, this seems like a bigger like international like misadventure disaster than like for the country itself, the invading
Yeah.
country, than Iraq. I mean, just like, well, who knows? I mean, we're only 6 weeks into this disaster,
Yeah,
but it just
I
seems
think
like, Iraq was a catastrophe. Like stupidest, one of the stupidest things in American history. Definitely the stupidest like foreign policy move in my lifetime. And like after 6 weeks, this seems worse for Russia. But I don't know. Like there was no chance
I
that
don't know.
George Bush was going to
Bush
be,
got reelected. Bush got
yeah, Bush got
reelected after
reelected,
Iraq.
and there was no chance like that, like the CIA chief was going to like shoot Bush in the head. There seems very little chance that the head of whatever the new version of the KGB
Yeah,
is called will shoot Putin in the head. But it seems like that is somewhat of a possibility that there could be a palace coup
there
or
could be
something.
one. I mean, so we're taping this on April 13th. It's almost, it's like 6 days before people will first, see and hear it. But I think, a lot depends on what he winds up with. I think given that, I think he didn't plan for this to last this long. He thought it would be wrapped up, certainly by now. Even though, they may not have been, there probably was a plan B. They probably thought, well, if Kyiv doesn't, if regime change doesn't work, we at least wind up with the Donbass and some other stuff in the east. And that's where they are now. And I think, again, this is one place cognitive empathy comes in. We are assuming there's a common assumption in the West that now it's already been so costly for them that he can't come out of this without facing grave dangers on the domestic political front. And I don't think that's true. I think if the next 2-3 weeks went swimmingly, which they may well not, but if they did, and he wound up controlling all of those two provinces in the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, and the land bridge to Crimea and parts of Kharkiv province, maybe not the city itself, whatever. And he hung on to a lot of that. I think that could be seen as certainly as enough of a victory in Russia. And I think one thing we tend to miss is that how much of a price it's worth paying from the point of view of Russians depends on how the war is framed. Like we're thinking, wait a second, you went and picked on a dinky country and it cost you this much blood and treasure. You can't consider that a win. But remember, they're not thinking of this. He is framing this, and with some justice, actually, as a fight against the American empire. Okay. His whole framing of this war is that it's not like, hey, we're going to squash Ukrainian democracy. Okay. That's not the way they think of it over there. They're like, America was behind the 2014 Ukrainian coup. America's been sending weapons in there. America is just the other day, Austin, our Secretary of Defense, tweeted proudly, hey, we just trained some more Ukrainians in America. We're going to send them back to Ukraine. Now, that is publicity gold for Putin, okay? That's exactly his narrative. And to the extent that people in in Russia, accept that framing, he can get away with a lot of dead bodies, a lot of dead Russian soldiers, if he has something meaningful to show for it. And he says, the American empire tried to stop us from securing these Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine for the welfare of native Russian speakers or whatever. That message can sell. And that's why I think the
Right.
jury's out. Now, I think the war may not go so well for him in the next few weeks. That's a real possibility.
It's
That
also
will be a
like,
problem.
I mean, let's say that instead of invading the entire country, he had only invaded the separatist regions, or let's say that he decided to pull back and say, we've decided to give peace a chance. I assume the Russian mass public, would have gone along with any of those decisions and widely supported them, because they seem to, the media and just like following patriotism and following the leader, they would have been like, oh yes, I like if he had decided let's pull back and we'll talk, and they end up cutting some sort of deal. I don't think there'd be like an uprising in the streets saying no, we want we want the Donbass. Like I think people just would have gone along more or less with whatever he chose to do. So it's weird that this one man's individual decision so much weight upon it. And he and whatever. I mean, it seems like he needs something, and maybe it'll be like recognition of Crimea or something as part of Russia. But whatever, I think he could probably, if he stays in power, he can sell whatever it is and say, "Oh yeah, we killed all the Nazis." and we liberated the Russian speakers, and the domestic consumption,
Yeah.
we'll buy it. The thing is, if there's like some coterie of leaders in the elite who want their yachts back or something, or just want Russia to be sort of a normal country, and there's I would say he's much more threatened by elite opinion. And there's a smaller coterie of elites, and most of them are like directly loyal to him or his childhood friends or something. So that's one way an authoritarian stays in power. But that seems
Yeah.
more the threat to him than the people
Yeah.
uprising, because they seem to just go along with
Yeah. Well,
whatever he says, unless there's even more disasters,
I
for
mean, a
years of
couple.
disasters.
I mean, first of all, the oligarchs do not have as much political influence as they had under Yeltsin. Okay, that was a change that Putin made. He made it clear who's in charge here. It's like you can go and make your money, but I am not going to be hostage to you. That apparently is a real change that happened. He put at least one of them in jail to make the point.
Hmm.
And that they had to kind of not cause political trouble for him. Okay, if they wanted to keep making their money. That doesn't mean they are of no significance, but they don't have as much influence as they may have had under Yeltsin. Meanwhile, there is also among elites, national security elites, and so on, there is a strong, kind of nationalist sentiment. There was some pressure on him to do something in Ukraine. I don't mean he really needed the pushing. I think he wanted to do something, but there are people who there are some voices in Russia of some significance who wouldn't be satisfied with just the Donbass. Now, he could have totally sold that. And I also think if he had gone in a more obviously circumscribed way, like just pushing the frontiers on the Donbass, I think he might not have encountered nearly as draconian a bunch of sanctions either. I think
Yeah,
it was
that makes
partly the
sense to me.
shock and awe part of the invasion that galvanized Europe. And
Yeah,
so I
and
think that might have been smarter in a number of ways.
right. So something I think, and sometimes I read the comments on your episodes, and something I've seen the commenters criticize you about is empathy and/or cognitive empathy for the Ukrainian people and their agency within this, great power struggle, and they are the ones fighting and dying in this battle.
Mm.
And I mean, I don't think they're going to get like Ukrainian public opinion is. I mean, it would take like a real war of attrition or something to
Mhm.
really grind them down, and the atrocities that are like being uncovered from incompetent Russian occupation of various towns and so forth, like aren't is not going to make the average Ukrainian more eager to cut a deal. I think they're going to be outraged and they want revenge.
I have written this in the Friday edition of the newsletter, Nonzero newsletter. I said exactly that part. The positions are hardening on both sides. Now, as for but it's interesting when people say, "Hey, Bob, what about some cognitive empathy for the Ukrainians?" Often that means they're not getting the first point, that cognitive empathy is not the same as emotional empathy. Often what they mean is, shouldn't we care about their welfare? Well, of course we care about their welfare. I'm one of the people who was arguing that we should engage in serious negotiation to prevent the war and keep a bunch of them from being killed. Okay. But as for, if you're trying to stop the invasion, the exercise of cognitive empathy needs to be primarily directed toward the guy who's going to decide whether there's going to be an invasion. That would be Putin, right? And I don't think we were doing a good job of that. I agree that, you definitely want to try to understand all perspectives. I mean, that said, I think few in America are doing a very good job of understanding the political forces that are shaping the psychology on the Ukrainian side, because we've bought into this very idealistic kind of framing, like evil, authoritarian, even totalitarian regime invades marvelous liberal democracy. They're just like us, and that's not true. There are, Zelensky has, I think, been under some pressure for some time from the hard nationalist right, which includes this Azov brigade with its Nazi past, and includes the political forces that it's aligned with. And that doesn't get much play in the American press. So it's not like Americans are doing a great job of cognitive empathy with Ukrainians, but not with Russians. They're doing a terrible job with both, if you ask me. In terms of our commentator elites on,
Mhm.
op-ed pages, CNN, I don't think they're shedding much light on the relevant psychology on either side in terms of what's actually shaping the decision making.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a very simplistic good guys, bad guys dynamic that a lot of people, both commentators and normal people, quote unquote normal people you see on social media who have added the Ukrainian flag onto their profiles and stuff like that. And I think there's various obvious explanations for that. Yeah, the superpower invading a smaller country. I mean, just any country invading another country. I live in Jersey City, and there actually is a historic Ukrainian population here, but I've seen, makeshift Ukrainian flag color banners up, and I doubt. Actually, I did see one today. Someone like in Brighton Beach or something. Someone chalked a Russian flag and a Z. But
I can open my when if I pull my curtains back, I can see my neighbor's Ukrainian flag. I
right,
mean,
so there's so some of that is good guy, bad guy, big bad wolf, kind of thing that I think is very natural. But yeah, I think it's just like the Ukrainians are the ones who ultimately who are suffering the vast majority of deaths, injuries, disruption to their lives, destruction of their houses, and so forth. And their interests, I mean, they're going to be the whatever settlement is reached. They're the ones who have to live with it, literally. And let's say some sort of deal is cut in which the Donbass territories become quasi independent republics or something within Moscow's orbit. Like, there's going to be a lot of people who don't want to live there anymore and want to go somewhere else. Perhaps somewhere else in Ukraine or somewhere else or move to Russia or something.
a
And there's
lot of
probably
them will have left. A lot of by the time the fighting
and if
really
the
heats up.
entire land is conquered the way Russia seems to conquer, it'll be like Moonscape or something, and there won't be any living people there anymore. They would have had to flee or they would have been killed. So there's a 20,000-foot perspective on these things with grand strategy, and then there's like the people who are obviously suffering. And I guess so. And part of like if you want your preferred foreign policy vision to prevail, I think you need to lend more credence to that sort of, maybe it's regular empathy or something of like, the people who are paying the price and whose lives are being destroyed
Look,
by
the
this.
things I have been arguing that the path we're on is the path to a bunch of dead Ukrainians right now. The path the U.S. is on, Ukraine is on. The way we kind of just slowly accelerate the provision of weapons to whatever level is necessary to keep Russia from making encroachments is just a way of sustaining the fighting for as long as possible. And I've been arguing against the people like, okay, so the Ann Applebaums of the world, the Russia hawks, the Michael McFalls, who are basically saying more or less like keep fighting until you chase the Russian troops out of the country. That's a recipe for a whole lot of dead Ukrainians. Okay, that's a recipe for more dead Ukrainians than saying let's be mindful of the opportunity to cut a deal, even if it leaves Russia with some territory they occupy. Okay, so I don't know how you come off depicting my position as insensitive to the needs of Ukrainians. In a way, the downside of some kind of early peace deal is the precedent it sets by giving some degree of positive reinforcement for an invasion. And the price for that is kind of distributed all over the world in a certain sense, or at least beyond Ukraine. So I don't even know what I don't quite get. What is it, how am I being insensitive to Ukrainian suffering? I don't understand. What is even the allegation?
Okay, so let's say that when Putin invaded, Zelensky had said, "Okay, I'm fleeing the country. It's yours." You could imagine that happening, and that's kind of what happened in Afghanistan in some respect. Was the army gave up and the president fled. That would have resulted in fewer dead Ukrainians. So on like a pure utilitarian short scale, like would have stopped death and suffering and etc., destruction of cities if they had just surrendered. Now, if Zelensky had fled, it's possible that like militias would have risen up to repel the invaders anyway, because they don't want these fucking Russian soldiers driving through their towns or occupying their schools or raping their wives and daughters. Like, it is just very natural. So any sort of peace deal will have to be like accepted by the Ukrainian people. I think that's what I'm aiming at is that, like, if they cut a deal for the Donbass, like, don't you think it's going to be irregulars within Ukraine who say, no, we want, like, the Donbass is ours. We want the Donbass back. Like, they have as much of a claim to it as Putin does. And then you have, like, some sort of insurgency or, like, guerrilla war for a long period of time and even more death and destruction and
Well,
so
I mean,
forth.
you might, I don't know. But I'm just making the point that it's far from clear that the people who purport to be so concerned about the welfare of the Ukrainians have tended to advocate policies that maximize the chances of Ukrainians dying. And it goes back to before the war, when they did not want to negotiate meaningfully with Russia. Okay. And I would remind you that if we had negotiated, we would not and headed off a war. And I'm not sure we could have, but they didn't even want to try. We'll never know whether we could have, because we did not offer to just freeze NATO expansion, for example, a key Russian demand. We didn't offer to do that. We didn't offer to abide by the Minsk agreement, which would give the Donbass provinces some autonomy within Ukraine and so on. We didn't offer those things. And for all we know, that would have prevented a lot of death. It would have given no positive reinforcement for invasion. That would have been kind of positive reinforcement for threatening to invade. But look, I'm just making the point that I don't understand. I just don't understand how people somehow equate my positions with indifference to the suffering of Ukrainians. It just makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, maybe, I mean,
people who argue that you're not pursuing avenues to peace and avenues that could prevent war are these callous monsters who don't care about the suffering of the people who die in the war they're trying to prevent.
Well, there's their suffering, and then there's also, like, their agency or their volition as, like, independent actors in a country in which they decide that, that they voted on their leader. And so
no one has a sovereign right to join NATO. Okay.
But Ukraine is never joining NATO at this point.
Who knows? That's probably.
But Sweden and Finland might, and once again showing that this was a strategic disaster on Putin's side. I mean, we've talked about this a lot. There's a couple other things we wanted to cover, but I mean, the other sort of hobby horse type thing that you've talked about a lot is international law, and since this is, I guess, I mean, Crimea was obviously violating international law, annexing other territory. This is a big violation of international law. Seems like international law is not doing a great job in general, and the U.S. has contributed to that by ignoring it, especially with the Iraq invasion.
Well, violating it, yes.
Right. This is as clear cut. We can say at least as clear cut or more clear cut a violation of international law as the Iraq invasion, and at least they sort of went through the motions of respecting international law in some ways. Like, there was the presentation before the UN and blah blah blah, but the Iraq war was a total disaster, and so we have this huge violation of international law. We have seeming war crimes are seemingly being committed under some true system of international justice, like Vladimir Putin would end up in The Hague or something like that. But none of that seems like it could happen in any realistic world. So where does you think this leaves international law? It's certainly not better than it was 2 months ago.
No, it's not. And that's why I'm not, it's so weird. It's like, I mean, that's why I have not come out against things like sanctions. I mean, I think we're overdoing them probably. They're probably going to lead to no good place. I haven't come out against now providing support for Ukraine against Russia. And that's because I take international law so seriously. So, yeah, I think you should try to provide negative reinforcement for the violation of international law. But there's a limit to how much negative reinforcement you can provide when the violator is a nuclear power. That's why we could invade Iraq. Kind of same idea. We're a superpower, there's only so much they're going to do. B, this is why I keep harping on the mistakes we made that led to this situation. One reason I really want to avoid steering us towards situations where another country is likely to invade some country is that then that creates, first of all, a lot of suffering, but also the unfortunate example of a violation of international law that may not be punished adequately. And so I'm sorry, but I'm going to keep coming back to the fact that it was nothing short of foreign policy malpractice to get us to this point where there was this invasion. And so I don't know what else I can say. I mean, the other thing that I think constrains how much negative reinforcement I'm going to be in favor of providing a country that invades other countries is that we keep doing it ourselves. I mean, it would be one thing if Biden said, this is a major violation of international law. This can't go on, but I think it should be the occasion for a clean start, and it's time that America fessed up. It has done, no, seriously. I mean, it would be one thing if we had a president who's going to say, look, we really need to quit violating international law ourselves if we're going to now demand that, ask the whole world to get on board for major pushback against this violation. That would make me feel a lot more comfortable with major pushback. And I'm just fucking sick of the hypocrisy of us continuing to do this. And Americans not even being aware, and the people in the blob, the people who shape, these people at these think tanks and so on, they're barely aware themselves. It's just incredible. It's embarrassing. And by the way, this is one reason I think everyone's framing this as, the big crime here is what we're doing here is protecting democracy, right? That's an easier thing for us to say, because if you say we're protecting, we're defending principles of international law, well, that's obviously bullshit. We are the leading violators of international law over the last 30 years, probably. There's some competition for that title, but we're as bad as anybody.
Russia is giving us a run for our money,
for the last 10. For the last 10, yeah. But over the last 20, 30.
Well, someone who actually, what you're saying, I don't think any American person is ever going to give that sort of like mea culpa speech, but someone who sort of gestured in that direction was Donald Trump, who said something like, you don't think we're killers? Like, we're killers. Like that was sort of his cynical, like, level. Someone said something bad about Putin, and then he defended Putin by saying, like, oh, like, you think we haven't killed?
Right, but he would never, but Trump would never say a kind word about international law.
No, he doesn't give a shit about any law, domestic or international, especially when it constrains him in any way. Okay, we talked about this for a while. Other possible topics were me complaining about Mickey, and talking about the future of blogging heads.
Yeah, well, it's your call. You're guiding the conversation.
Well, I'll complain about Mickey briefly at least.
Okay.
And so Mickey Kaus,
I encourage that.
Blogger, blogging pioneer, co-founder of Blogging Heads, current weekly conversation partner of you in the Parrot Room and the pre-Parrot Room conversation. And he and I've sort of like trolled him for a while online. And then, especially after January 6th, I said something not so nice about him. And I spent about 15 or 20 minutes an episode into with Daniel Bessner around a year ago, where I made out the full anti-Mickey case. But I guess sort of like, I jokingly said my house problem and ours, because I feel like there is sort of a like, do you think, I guess by putting it plainly, like, do you think that you talking to Mickey for like 3 or 4 hours a week is ultimately good for like your understanding the world and furthering goals of international cooperation and peace? That
you don't think we've brought peace to the world yet?
Well, I don't know. I just think he's kind of gone off in such strange directions. He's a very idiosyncratic guy, and his idiosyncratic thinker, and he's weirdly, like, it's not like you're talking to like a Trump Republican, because he's a Trump supporter and voted for him twice, but like his concerns are not the average Trump voter's concerns. Like, he's very concerned about legal immigration and about child welfare payments, fully refundable or not. Those are like his two main policy positions. And obviously a lot of Trump voters care about immigration, but he's sort of like a one-issue voter on immigration. And sometimes he talks about like the deplorables as sort of like, like he's part of that group. But I just think
you consider him deplorable, don't you?
I do, but the people who self-identify as deplorables or patriots or something, who are sort of like marching beneath the Trump banner, like, he does not speak for those people. Like, he's not he's not like a lifelong conservative, and he doesn't believe in the pedophilic cabal of blood drinkers who Trump was fighting against. Like, he has his own weird angle into Trump. So I think it's I think you could learn more about the world if you're talking to like a genuine MAGA person every week.
Well,
but
I think I mean, he's not full on classic MAGA, but he understands. I think he understands the MAGA perspective. I think he's more in touch with it than I
I don't
am. Although I try to stay in touch with it. But
I know the way he frames issues. It just seems like I mean, obviously he like consumes right wing news and like will reference Breitbart and other right wing news outlets and Coulter, but I don't know. He just has it's an odd perspective. But anyway, the anti Mickey case is sort of like is like Mickeyism, like infecting Bobism in a
well, do you
possibly
see
negative way.
signs of that? You'd be a better judge than I.
Well, one thing, and I mentioned this in the document I sent you about topics would be like conspiratorial thinking, because Mickey is very conspiratorial in his understanding of politics, and
Right.
he popularized this term kabuki, which is like, there's sort of like a dumb show in front that the politicians are acting out, but like the real stuff is happening behind the scenes. I think there's like that's not a crazy way to understand politics, but he often seems to think there's hidden machinations behind the scenes and something is really going on, or like what's the real thing, who's like really talking to Biden and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I mean, there's, we're living in a very conspiratorial time, and the events of the past couple of years have shown how many Americans believe conspiracy theories in general. I think they're generally false, and I think it's not a profitable way to really think about what's happening in the world. And I don't know, that seems to be sort of one of his core under like
And you
ways of
see
viewing
signs
things.
that I'm being infected with this? Is the
Well, I don't know. I
tinfoil
mean,
hat I'm wearing now the
well, I mean, he puts on the tinfoil hat sometimes, literally, when he gets into his more speculative
yeah,
um,
we should
ideas.
emphasize that he's joking when he does that.
Right.
But
But yeah,
uh
well, he has lots of props.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you do two episodes more or less a week with him, then one episode where you're talking to someone. I'm one such someone today. Usually it's someone who knows more about the world than I do. But it's like, yeah, that much Mickey exposure, I feel like, is not good for clear thinking about the world, because I just think he's wrong about so many things, and one of the most obvious is that he voted for Trump twice.
Yeah, I don't really see signs that he's influenced. I'm trying to think. I mean, first of all, you're right. I have another show I do that comes out every Tuesday. That's always with somebody else, and those tend to be that's where I tend to bring on like area experts and stuff. And you know, I mean, first of all, look, the idea of a podcast conversation that's regular, right? Two, three people, same crew. That obviously seems to have some audience appeal just generically. A lot
Oh,
of
for
people
sure,
do
yeah.
it, and you know the feeling like, okay, I know what this chemistry is going to be. I like it. Not everybody likes our chemistry, Mickey and my chemistry, but some people do. I
I
mean,
like the
also,
chemistry more than I like what Mickey's saying, for sure. I
right.
mean that.
I mean, that's the other thing is it's not like there's a whole lot of different people I could do this with. Mickey and I have a very distinctive relationship. We've known each other a very long time. And we there are big contrasts in our ideologies, but there's a kind of a commonality in our sensibility. You know what I mean? It's like, and that's why on the conspiracy thinking, I don't think I'm in principle all that far away. I think we're both kind of have a somewhat cynical view of the way the system works, and go around as carrying us, I think, an assumption into our assessment that good journalists should carry, which is that things may not be what they appear to be. I'm definitely carrying that into the war. I mean, the Ukraine war, there's so much sympathy in America for Ukraine. And again, that's where my sympathies lie. But it so pervades the media's presentation to it that, I'm always trying to look deeper whenever any kind of story comes out with a pro-Ukraine spin. I immediately do a second check, because I think that's what you should do. War is an especially reliable disorder of information. Anyway, I think Mickey and I are both inclined to do that. So anyway, I'm just saying there's certain things about our sensibility that we have in common that I think facilitate chemistry. And then there's these contrasts, both in our ideology and in some ways in our characters. In some ways, I don't know what I mean. It sounds like you actually listened to it as conversational combinations that you deplore go. it sounds like this one is one that continues to attract you more than many, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a listening, watching blogging heads for many years at this point. I guess about 15, and know you well, know Mickey a little bit. I keep on listening most weeks, and I find it compelling, but also very frustrating. And there's times where I'm, shaking my fist at the conversation. So it's definitely compelling.
And
I don't
wishing
know.
that I would give more
Well, I
pushback.
mean, yeah. Well, I mean, part of
My
it is sort of like,
defenses have been worn down in some ways, I admit.
yeah,
But
how much pushback can you offer when you're in this? I mean, you have a friendly relationship, but it's also a professional relationship because you're making money off of the Patreon, and then it's sort of like, could Laurel tell Hardy to go fuck himself or something? You guys are paired together, so but when Laurel and Hardy weren't arguing about whether or not Bob Saget was murdered or something like this, so um so yeah, I don't know. I mean, and Mickey has said some not so nice things about me on the show, and I've said
it's
some
not
not so
clear who
nice.
started that. That's a real
He did. Well, I did want to just clear up. One, and this was a while ago. He said I called him racist. I'm almost positive I did not. I've never called him racist. Not a charge I throw around lightly. I mean, I've called him like a fool and stuff like that, but I don't think I've called him racist. But yeah, I do think he just sort of, I don't know. There's something about his, obviously he gets my goat in various ways, and I've invited him on to talk to me directly, but
he should do it.
someone else who doesn't reply to my emails when I when I reach out.
I would
Um,
encourage him to do it. Now, you do remember, I hate to torment him with this memory, but years and years ago, Ezra Klein, you remember when Ezra Klein actually not only said, I'm throwing down the gauntlet to debate
yes,
Mickey Gauss, had a gauntlet and threw it
yes,
down
he had
on
a glove.
Blogging Heads
What?
TV.
Yeah, one of the early
this is
prop.
like 14 years ago or something.
Yes, but
And
I
Mickey
said,
declined.
Ezra
Didn't
Klein's much
debate
more
him.
handsome at age 25 than I am at age 39. So I think that was part of, Mickey thought that there's the contrast between youthful, youthful Ezra, and at that point, like 50 something Mickey would be, would just sway the viewers so much that he couldn't get a
Well, on the
fair
other
chance.
hand,
But
Mickey's not 50 something anymore.
that's true. That's true. But it would be, yeah, if he comes on my show, it'll be audio only. So no one would be swayed by my youthful
I'll tell him that.
visage. But yeah, so the invitation is still out there, Mickey. If you want to take it. I mean, do you want to briefly talk about future blogging heads and
Sure.
where do you see the site? I don't work for the site anymore. My show's no longer on the
Well,
site.
first of
But
all,
I'm still a consumer.
there's going to be a rebranding. I guess we haven't told you this. I mean,
I've seen it teased that there's going to be.
yeah, you
some
heard it in the
changes.
parrot room.
Yeah.
I mean, look, blogging heads for people, there's probably few people listening or watching who remember this has now been 17 years, right? Since we started it. It had a reason for being. There's nothing else. There was no other in the realm of political discussion. There was no other place where you had online split screen video discussion debate, between two people who were in different places, right?
Right.
Because we, worked out the technology before people had broadband consistently. We had a way of doing it, and so for a while it was kind of the place. Also at the same time there was this group of people who were now influential in print journalism, but they weren't quite MSM. They were bloggers. And you didn't see them on cable TV by and large. You might see
Right.
the New York Times correspondent. So blogging heads became, first of all, the place for video debate discussion about politics online, and also the place where these, a lot of these people, Chris Hayes, Ezra Klein, Matt Iglesias, this is where they first showed up on video.
Mhm.
Ari Melber, a lot of cable TV people. And as you know, for a while, it was a feature on the New York Times. So unusual was it, right? It was like hard to believe, right? Like imagine like the Times goes to us to provide the technology. They did.
No, it's true. Yeah.
They weren't doing it. But now we've gotten to a point where any two people can easily arrange a video thing and put it on YouTube or put it on Substack. The reason for blogging heads existence is gone. There's no, anyone can do it. It may be that I could have, if I'd focused on this exclusively and been better at various things that I'm not great at, and maybe not spent time writing books, maybe I could have turned it into the Madison Square Garden of this, and it would still be that, and it would still be the place that people aspire to be seen. Who knows? Anyway, I didn't. It's not that. So, So it's just so we've been basically encouraging. I mean, first of all, it had changed from it had become a place where there were just basically a few regular or semi-regular shows, and we weren't doing a lot of setting up of these one-offs, which we used to do. Remember, you
Mhm.
remember, we used to like go out and look and go, oh, these two bloggers are arguing. Let's have them on, and they'll argue with each other in video. Um, it was no longer that anyway. It had like, your show, DMZ, my show, the Wright Show, the Glenn Show. About a year ago, we started encouraging people to spin off their things onto their own YouTube channels. One thing that had happened is that in addition to the Blogging Head site, we had the Blogging Head's YouTube channel because we were convinced by this guy who knows a lot about YouTube that it actually would make sense for all of us in terms of building up audience.
Mhm.
So Glenn has moved to his own channel. DMZ is about to move to their own YouTube channel. You have done that, although for now it's just audio that's on your YouTube channel, the Culturally Determined channel.
Yeah.
And so once it's complete, we're going to change the name to something with Nonzero in it, which is already the name of my newsletter. And it may have my name in it. There's a case for that, but it will definitely have Nonzero in it. And, it's a little bit of brand consolidation. As you know, there's probably two more brands than are optimal floating around my orbit. So the name of this will be a change in the name of the YouTube channel. I think ultimately what is called the Wright Show as an audio feed and as a show on the Blogging Heads network, the audio feed will become Robert Wright's Nonzero.
Mhm.
That'll probably become the name of the YouTube channel. Anyway, certainly Nonzero will be there. That'll be the unifying thing more. And it's from my point of view kind of bittersweet. But that's life. I mean, Blogging Heads was this great thing, and the archives will be there, and there's incredible stuff in the archives. I mean, tons of people were on Blogging Heads.
So is Glenn going to stick with the site? Do you know, or is the site mainly
Well,
going to be your content?
I suspect that after the brand change, I mean, first of all, the site itself, there are still loyalists who go there. It is in quantitative terms not a big part of the picture. Like a large majority of the people who watch the video do it on YouTube, and there are as many people who only listen to the audio as there are who watch the video at all. So the number of people who watch the thing on the site is a small fraction. The site will still be there. I think that for a few months after the rebranding, you'll still see Glenn in the Blogging Heads audio feed and on the site. And maybe for those few months, DMZ can be in the Blogging Heads audio feed. I mean, you could be. I never, you haven't been in the Blogging Heads audio feed lately, but I never meant to I assumed that was your decision.
Well, yeah, I wanted to try, doing some sort of monetization, which I'm, still a ways off, but
Yeah.
I think you were generally averse to running ads. And I saw some possibilities for ads, although, my traffic is not huge. And I'm rebuilding because I lost the people who were listening to plugins there. And yeah, some sort of Patreon thing. It just made, and plus I'd always, I mean, we had a long behind the scenes debates about the importance of the video, the importance of the audio. I always saw my thing more as like a regular podcast where it was mainly people were consuming it, while they're commuting or taking a walk or doing dishes or something like that, and less appointment viewing where people are sitting down and watching me. And so
Yeah.
I thought it made more sense to focus on that. But yeah, I mean, it is, there was a time Blogging Heads was right in the middle of it where there was all these independent people who were using the new technology to make names for themselves. And then a lot of those people sort of like merged together and, or joined larger organizations like launching Vox or something. So that was two original Blogging Heads people, Klein and Iglesias. And then so there was sort of a started diffusion. There was people getting jobs, because they needed health insurance or something at actual organizations. And so that, like, the coming together period, like Bloodgates sort of came with that, and then it sort of became a core group of shows. But now there's like another dispersal that like Substack and other things are encouraging, where people are leaving, or they're either they're either going off on their own, or they're getting hired by the New York Times. Seems to be the two ways you can make a living in media these days. And it is more, yeah, and getting more into like what it was 15 years ago, of like individual brands, individual names, where you only want Matt Iglesias' take, so you subscribe to his thing. And yeah, fewer people are, I don't know, it seems like the energy is more in personal branding and individual personalities and stuff like that, which it does vibe with sort of like a hosted podcast.
Right. And as far as Substack, whenever anybody on Substack wants to have a conversation with somebody else, they can use Substack to distribute that. They can easily record it as audio, video. So yeah, the landscape is changing quite a bit. I would, if I were you, I would stick at least some of your audio podcasts in the Blogging Heads audio feed while it is a unified feed. Which is to say over the next, month or two or whatever, and have a thing up front telling people that if they want to keep getting your show, they should subscribe to the Culturally Determined podcast feed.
Yeah, maybe.
Because,
maybe
because the Blogging Heads feed still does pretty good traffic. It does about. I mean, I am on both feeds now, the Wright Show and Blogging Heads, and the two have about the same number of subscribers. Right. The audio podcast,
but just the energy is less in subscribing to something like Blogging Heads than in subscribing to Robert Wright's thing, Glenn Lowry's thing.
Well, that's true, but it never hurts to also be, it's like Ricochet does a super feed of all these conservative podcasts. Okay, yeah. And you can subscribe if you're conservative to the Ricochet super feed. Now we're not going to continue that for more than another 5-6 months, but and maybe less, but I'm just saying, I think it's in your interest to do that and advertise the fact that you have an independent podcast feed. I mean, we're advertising it now, but it doesn't hurt.
Yes, and that Culturally Determined, whatever podcast app you use, subscribe, rate, and review, tell your friends. Okay, we've gone on for a while, and I'm not sure if I have anything else. So maybe we should wrap things up there.
I suppose, yeah. I think we've gotten to almost everything on your list of topics, so that's not bad. And yeah, people should check out your show, and they should check out DMZ, all the Blogging Heads legacy shows, and needless to say, the Glenn Show, which is doing very well.
Yes. Yeah, I think the content is still generally strong. But yeah, it makes sense. Rebranding makes sense to me. It seems like there was that old model, time had passed it by. So I'm I am somewhat sad if Blogging Heads, the brand, is being replaced or something, but it makes sense for I think, given what the world is like these days.
Yeah, I mean, plus let's face it, the term blogging doesn't
I said that I was saying this for a long time. Yeah, blogs are dead and TV is sort of dying as well. Then you're just stuck with heads, and
Well, plus, I mean, people may not get the reference anymore to Talking Heads. I mean, the Talking Heads was not just the name of a musical group, which many people have probably forgotten, but also it was a reference to what the term we used to use for like people on cable news and stuff and evening news. They were Talking Heads. So it's an antiquated brand in so many ways, and I think it should get a proper, I don't want to say burial, but a nice place in a museum, or maybe it's a museum of its own, and the archives will be there.
Okay, well that's good to hear. There is, I mean, I can imagine future like intellectual historians. I think actually Daniel Bessner said this explicitly. Using the Blogging archives as a way to understand.
I'm telling you, man, I was just looking at the 2008 conversation between Bob Kagan and Frank Fukuyama on Blogging Heads TV, where Frank is saying Putin is going to be, he predicts it basically. He says, I think the stuff we've done in Kosovo, there was the intervention and now we're pushing for Kosovo independence. It's driving Russia crazy. I think they're going to use it as an excuse to start screwing around in Georgia. Frank calls it. Okay. And these are significant. There are a lot of significant conversations.
Yeah, and especially I know that a lot of, I mean, just people who sort of mid-level intellectuals or writers or thinkers who kept blogs, a lot of those have sort of like link rot, like sort of, they forgot to pay their, pay to keep the URL or something, or the whatever was hosting it disappeared, and so there's a lot of stuff has vanished from that era of blogging. So keeping
and
blogging
I
hits.
should say, I think we're just gonna, the site itself, Blogging Heads TV, I think we're just going to leave it that URL. It will be where the archives are. And my stuff will probably continue to post there. I mean, for the months to come, so will Glenn's and so on. But there's no reason, if you're going to put a video on YouTube, if I'm going to have my show on YouTube, there's no reason it can't be there. But the main thing is that, and I don't, even though, YouTube channel, the podcast are changing to Nonzero, we will probably put something up there to signify that. But I think at that one place, the term Blogging Heads will survive, both at the URL and in some form in the logo, and the archives will be there. And in fact, we're actually cleaning up. We're actually going through now and making sure, because there are some dead links, or there's some links where you don't get the video, but you get the audio, or you blah blah blah. We're cleaning that up.
Okay, that's good. That's a service. That's a service to future historians, I think.
Archaeologists yet unborn can rest assured that as they sift through the ruins of our civilization, they'll be able to see where the trouble began.
Yeah, well, hopefully, I think we all can agree that we hope that, the current conflict in Ukraine does not lead to nuclear escalation. So hopefully there will be historians 50 or 100 years from now looking back and trying to figure out how America became so crazy. And Blogging Heads could be a resource for that.
And by the way, I don't think we explicitly said, a lot of people know that you worked for Blogging Heads for a long time and played a big role in a lot of our early successes. So there.
Yes, and proud to have contributed to to the cause. But now doing my own thing, Culture Determined, YouTube,
check it out,
podcast feed, ARYEHCW on Twitter if you want to follow me there. Yeah.
Amen.
All right. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Aryeh. See you.
Bye.